The French Inferno, across the ocean. France was the epicenter of European culture and power, but beneath the glittering surface of its royal court, the kingdom was rotting from within. The French state, under King Louis XVI, was built on a system of gross inequality known as the Ancien or the Old regime. Society was divided into three classes or estates. The first estate was the Catholic clergy, who owned 10% of the land and paid no taxes. The second estate was the nobility, who held the top positions in the government and military, and were also exempt from most taxes. Together, these two privileged orders made up less than 3% of the population. The remaining 97% of French citizens belonged to the third estate. This was everyone else, from wealthy doctors and lawyers of the bourgeoisie to the urban workers of Paris, down to the millions of rural peasants. The third estate bore the entire tax burden of the nation. They paid taxes to the king, taxes to the church, and feudal dues to their local lords. In the late 1780s, a series of bad harvests sent the price of bread, the staple of their diet, soaring. For the common person, life was a daily struggle against starvation and injustice. This social crisis was compounded by a catastrophic financial crisis. The French treasury was bankrupt. Decades of extravagant spending by the monarchy and costly wars had drained the nation's wealth. The single greatest expense? The money and resources France had sent to support the American Revolution. The ideals of liberty that France had helped secure for America had come at the price of its own financial ruin. Desperate, King Louis XVI proposed a radical solution, taxing the first and second estates. The privileged orders refused. The political deadlock forced the king to take a fateful step. In 1789, he called for a meeting of the Estates General, an assembly of representatives from all three estates for the first time in 175 years. The meeting was a disaster from the start. The third estate, representing the vast majority of the people, demanded fair representation and voting by head rather than by estate. When the king and the privileged orders refused, the third estate took matters into their own hands. On June 20, 1789, finding themselves locked out of their usual meeting hall, they gathered at a nearby indoor tennis court. There, they swore a solemn oath, the tennis court oath, not to disband until they had written a new constitution for France. They boldly declared themselves the true representatives of the nation, the National Assembly. It was the first act of the French Revolution. As political events unfolded, the people of Paris grew restless and fearful. Rumors flew that the king was gathering his army to crush the new National Assembly. The people needed weapons to defend themselves. On July 14, 1789, a massive crowd of angry Parisians marched on the Bastille. The Bastille was a medieval fortress used as a prison, a hated symbol of the king's absolute and arbitrary power. The crowd stormed the fortress, overwhelmed its guards, and tore it down brick by brick. The fall of the Bastille was a seismic event. It demonstrated that the people, when united, were stronger than the king. Inspired by the American Declaration of Independence, the National Assembly issued its own foundational document in August, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It proclaimed that men are born and remain free and equal in rights, and that these rights included liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. The ideas of the Enlightenment were now the official principles of the French Revolution. However, the French Revolution would follow a far more violent and chaotic path than its American predecessor. The king and queen, Louis and Marie Antoinette, remained symbols of the old order. In October 1789, a crowd of thousands of Parisian women, furious over the price of bread, marched 12 miles to the Palace of Versailles. They forced the royal family to return with them to Paris, where they would be under the watchful eye of the people. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The revolution grew more radical. As neighboring monarchies in Austria and Prussia threatened to invade to restore the king's power, a sense of patriotic fervor and paranoia swept through France. In 1792, the monarchy was abolished, and France was declared a republic. In January 1793, King Louis XVI was put on trial for treason and executed by the new, terrifyingly efficient invention, the guillotine. The death of the king ushered in the most radical phase of the revolution, the Reign of Terror. Led by the Committee of Public Safety and its ascetic, ruthless leader, Maximilien Robespierre, the revolution began to devour its own. The committee's goal was to purify the nation of its enemies. Vague accusations of being counter-revolutionary were enough to send anyone, from aristocrats to former revolutionary leaders, to the guillotine. Over the course of a year, an estimated 40,000 people were executed or died in prison. The ideals of liberty were drowned in a river of blood. The terror eventually burned itself out. In 1794, Robespierre himself was arrested and guillotined, a victim of the very system he had created. A period of instability followed under a weak government called the Directory. The French people, exhausted by a decade of chaos and war, longed for stability and order. They found it in a brilliant, ambitious young general who was a product of the revolution itself, Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1799, Napoleon seized power in a coup d'etat. He brought order, stabilized the economy, and achieved stunning military victories that made him a hero to the French people. In 1804, in a magnificent ceremony, he crowned himself Emperor of the French. The French Revolution, which had begun with the goal of destroying absolute monarchy, had ended with the creation of an absolute emperor. It was the ultimate irony.